Well, the book I've chosen today is The Thin Red Line by James Jones. It's also one of my favourite movies made by Terrence Malick, but it's a terrific novel as well. And James Jones was a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, and this book follows the fortunes of C for Charlie Company, a rifle, one of the army infantry divisions that arrives on Guadalcanal in the second half of the campaign. And I'm going to start from Chapter 4. Dawn came and passed, and still they waited. The roses and blues of the dawn light changed to the pearl and misty greys of early morning light. Of course, everyone had been up and nervously ready since long before dawn. But for today, Colonel Toole had requested a new artillery wrinkle. Because of yesterday's heavy repulse, Toole had asked for and got an artillery time-on-target shoot. This device, an artillery technique left over from World War I, was a method of calculating so that the first rounds of every battery hit their various targets simultaneously. Under TOT fire, men caught in the open would suddenly find themselves enveloped in a curtain of murderous fire without the usual warning of a few shells arriving early from the nearest guns. The thing to do was to wait a bit, play poker with them, try to catch them when they were out of their holes for breakfast or an early morning stretch. So they waited. Along the crest, the silent troops stared across a silent ravine to the silent hilltop, and the silent hill stared back. C for Charlie, waiting with the assault companies on the slope below, could not even see this much. Nor did they care. They crouched over their weapons in total and unspeakable insularity, so many separate small islands. To their right and to their left, A for Abel and B for Baker did the same. At exactly 22 minutes after first daylight, Colonel Toole's requested TOT fire struck, an earthquaking, solidly tangible, continuous roar on Hill 210. The artillery fired 3-minute concentrations at irregular intervals, hoping to catch the survivors out of their holes. 20 minutes later, and before the barrage itself was ended, whistles began to blow along the crest of Hill 209. The assault companies had no recourse except to begin to move. Minds cast frantically about for legitimate last-minute excuses, and found none. In the men themselves, nervous fear and anxiety, contained so long and with such effort in order to appear brave, now begun to come out in yelled exhortations and yelps of gross false enthusiasm. They moved up the slope, and in bunches, crouching low and carrying their rifles in one or both hands. They hopped over the crest and commenced to run sideways and crouching down the short forward slope to the flat, rocky ground in front. Men in the line shouted encouragement to them as they passed through. A small cheer, dwarfed by the distant mountains, rose and died. A few slapped some of them roughly on the shoulder as they went through. Men who would not die today winked lustily at men who, in some cases, would soon be dead. On C for Charlie's right, 50 yards away, A for Abel was going through an identical ritual. They were rested. At least, they were comparatively so. They had not had to stand watch one half of the night, and they had not been up on the line where jitters precluded sleep, but down below, protected, and they had been fed and watered. If few of them had slept much, at least they were better off than the men on the line. Corporal Fife was one of those who had slept the least. He still could not get over Little Bede's having killed that Jap like that. What with that, the rain, the total lack of shelter from the rain, and his nervous excitation about tomorrow, he had only dozed once for about 5 minutes. But the loss of sleep did not bother him. He was young and healthy and fairly strong. In fact, he had never felt healthier or in better shape in his life. The earlier in the day, in the first grey of early light, he had stood forth upon the slope, and, exuding energy and vitality, had looked a long time down the ravine as it fell and deepened toward the rear, until he wanted to spread wide his arms with sacrifice and love of life and love of men. He didn't do it, of course. There were men awake all around him, but he had wanted to, and now as he dropped over the ridge and into the beginning of the battle, he shot one swift look behind him, one last look, and found himself staring head-on into the wide, brown, spectacle-covered eyes of Bugger Stein, who happened to be right behind him. What a hell of a last look, Fife thought sourly. Stein thought he had never seen such a deep, dark, intense, angrily haunted look as that which Fife bent on him as they dropped over the ridge, and Stein thought it was directed at him personally. They too were almost the last to go. Only Sergeant Welsh and young Bede remained behind them. And when Stein looked back, they were coming, hunched low, chopping with their feet, sliding down the shale and dirt of the slope. Stein's dispositions had been the same today as in the 2 previous days. They had done nothing much, and he saw no reason to change the march order. 1st platoon first, 2nd platoon second, 3rd in reserve. One of the 2 machine guns went with each forward platoon. The mortars would stay with the company HQ in the reserve. That was the way they had moved out, and as Stein slid to the bottom of 209's short forward slope, he could see 1st platoon pass out of sight beyond one of the little folds of ground which ran across their line of advance. They were about 100 yards ahead, and appeared to be deployed well. There were 3 of these little folds in the ground. All of them were perpendicular to the south face of Hill 209, parallel to each other. It had been Stein's idea, when inspecting the terrain with Colonel Toole the evening before, to utilize these as cover by shoving off from the right end of the hill and then advancing left across them and across his own front, instead of getting himself caught in the steeper ravine immediately between the 2 hills, as had happened to Fox Company. Toole had agreed to this. Afterward, Stein had briefed his own officers on it. Kneeling just behind the crest with them in the fading light, he pointed it all out and they looked it over. Somewhere in the dusk a sniper's rifle had spat angrily. One by one, they inspected it through binoculars. The 3rd and furthest left of these 3 folds was about 150 yards from the beginning of the slope, which became the Elephant's Neck. This slope steepened as it climbed to the U-shaped eminence of the Elephant's Head, which from 500 yards beyond commanded and brooded over the entire area. This 150-yard low area, as well as the 3rd fold, was dominated by 2 lesser grassy ridges growing out of the slope and 200 yards apart, one on either side of the low area. Both ridges were at right angles to the folds of the ground and parallel to the line of advance. With these in their hands, plus the Elephant's Head, the Japanese could put down a terrible fire over the whole approach area. Toole's plan was for the forward elements to move up onto these 2 ridges, locating and eliminating the hidden strongpoints there which had stopped 2nd Battalion yesterday, and then, with the reserve company to reinforce them, work their way up the Elephant's Neck to take the head. This was the bowling alley. But there was no way to outflank it. On the left it fell in a precipitous slope to the river, and on the right the Japanese held the jungle in force. It had to be taken frontally. All of this Stein had lined out for his officers last evening. Now they were preparing to execute it. Stein, at the bottom of the shale slope, could see very little of anything. A great racketing of noise had commenced and hung everywhere in the air, without seeming to have any source. Part, of course, was due to his own side firing all along the line, and the bombardment and the mortars. Perhaps the Japanese were firing too now, but he could see no visual signs of it. What time was it, anyway? Stein looked at his watch, and his little face stared back at him with an intensity it had never had before. 6:45, 6:45 in the morning. Back home he would be just... Stein realized he had never really seen his watch. He forced himself to put his arm down. Directly in front of him, his reserve 3rd platoon was spread out and flattened behind the first of the 3 little folds of ground. With them were the company HQ and the mortar section. Most of them were looking at him with faces as intense as his watch's face. Stein read crouching over them, his equipment bouncing and banging on him, shouting for them to set up the mortars there, motioning with his hand. Then he realized that he could only just barely hear his own voice himself, with all this banging and racketing of doom bouncing around in the air. How could they hear him? He wondered how the 1st platoon and the 2nd were doing, and how he could see. The 1st platoon at that particular moment was spread out and flattened behind the middle of the 3 little folds of ground. Behind it, the 2nd platoon was spread out and flattened in the low between the folds. Nobody really wanted to move. Young Lieutenant White had already looked over the area between this fold and the 3rd and seen nothing, and he already had motioned for his 2 scouts to proceed there. Now he motioned to them again, using an additional hand and arm signal meaning speed. The booming and banging and racketing in the air was bothering White too. It did not seem to come from any one place or several places, but simply hung and jounced in the air, sourceless. He too could see no visual end results of so much banging and exploding. His two scouts still not having moved, White became angry and opened his mouth and bellowed at them, motioning again. They could not see him, of course, but he knew they could see the black open hole of his mouth. Both of them stared at him, as though they thought him insane for even suggesting such a thing, but this time, after a moment, they moved. Almost side by side, they leaped up, crossed the crest of the little fold, and ran crouching down to the low, where they flattened themselves. After a moment they leaped up again, one a little behind the other, and ran bent almost double to the top of the last fold, and fell flat. After another moment, and a perfunctory peek over its top, they motioned White to come on. White jumped up, making a sweeping forward motion with his arm, and ran forward, his platoon behind him. As the first platoon moved, making the crossings as the scouts had. In two rushes, the second platoon moved on to the top of the middle fold. Back at the first fold of ground, Stein had seen this move and been a little reassured by it. Creeping close to the top of the fold among his men, he had raised himself to his knees to see, his face and whole patches of his skin twitching with mad alarm in an effort to call his insanity to his attention. When nothing hit him immediately, he stayed up, standing on his knees to see first platoon leave the middle fold and arrive at the crest of the third. At least they'd got that far. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. He lay back down, feeling quite proud, and realized his flattened men around him had been staring at him intently. He felt even prouder. Behind him, in the low of the fold, the mortar squads were setting up their mortars. Calling back to them through the infernal racketing still floating loose in the air, he shouted in Culp's ear for him to make the left-hand grassy ridge his target. At the mortars, Private Mazzi, the Italian boy from the Bronx, stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. So did most of the others. Stein crawled back to the top of the fold. He arrived and raised himself just in time to see first platoon and then second platoon attack. He was the only man along the top of the first fold who did see it, because he was the only man who was not flattened to the ground. He bit his lip. Even from here he could tell that it was bad, a serious tactical blunder. If tactical blunder it was, the fault was White's. First White, and secondly Lieutenant Tom Blaine of the second platoon. White had arrived at the top of the third and last fold of ground, without a casualty. This in itself seemed strange to him, if not highly over-optimistic. He knew his orders. He was to locate and eliminate the hidden strong points on the two grassy ridges. The nearest of these, the right-hand one, had its rather sharply defined beginning about 80 yards to his right front. While his men flattened themselves and stared at him with intense sweating faces, he raised himself cautiously on his elbow until only his eyes showed and inspected the terrain. Before him the ground fell, sparsely grassed and rocky, until it reached the beginnings of the little ridge, where it immediately became thickly grassed with the brown waist-high grass. He could not see anything that looked like Japanese or their emplacements. White was scared, but his anxiety to do well today was stronger. He did not really believe he would be killed in this war. Briefly, he glanced over his shoulder to the ridge of Hill 209, where groups of men stood half-exposed, watching. One of them was the corps commander. The loud banging and racketing hanging sourceless in the air had abated somewhat, had raised itself a few yards after the lifting of the barrage from the little ridges to the elephant's head. Again White looked at the terrain, and then motioned his scouts forward. Once again the two riflemen stared at him as though they thought he had lost his mind, as though they would have liked to reason with him if they hadn't feared losing their reputations. Again White motioned them forward, jerking his arm up and down in the signal for speed. The men looked at each other, then, gathering themselves on hands and knees first, bounded up and sprinted 25 yards down into the low area and fell flat. After a moment in which they inspected and found themselves still alive, they gathered themselves again. On hands and knees, preparing to rise, the first one suddenly fell down flat and bounced. The second, a little way behind him, got a little further up so that, when he fell, he tumbled on his shoulders and rolled onto his back. And there they lay, both victims of well-placed rifle shots by unseen riflemen. Neither moved again. Both were obviously dead. White stared at them, shocked. He had known them almost 4 months. He had heard no shots, nor had he seen anything move. No bullets kicked up dirt anywhere in front. Again he stared at the quiet, masked face of the deserted little ridge. What was he supposed to do now? The high, sourceless racketing in the air seemed to have gotten a little louder. White, who was a meaty, big young man, had been a champion boxer and a champion judo man at his university, where he is preparing himself to be a marine biologist, as well as having been the school's best swimmer. Anyway, they can't get all of us, he thought loyally, but meaning principally himself, and made his decision. "Come on, boys, let's get 'em!" he yelled, and leaped to his feet, motioning the platoon forward. He took 2 steps, the platoon with their bayonets fixed since early morning right behind him, and fell down dead, stitched diagonally from hip to shoulder by bullets, one of which exploded his heart. He had just time enough to think that he was dead, before he was. Perhaps he screamed. 5 others of his platoon went down with him, almost simultaneously, in various states of disrepair, some dead, some only nicked. But the impetus White had inaugurated remained, and the platoon charged blindly on. Another impetus would be needed to stop it, or change its direction. A few more men went down. Invisible rifles and machine guns hammered from what seemed to be every quarter of the globe. After reaching the 2 dead scouts, they came in range of the more distant left ridge, which took them with a heavy crossfire. Sergeant Big Queen, running with the rest and bellowing incoherently, and who had only been promoted 2 days before after the defection of Stack, watched the platoon sergeant, a man named Grove, throw his rifle from him as though he feared it, and go down hollering and clawing at his chest. Queen did not even think about it. Near him, PFC Doll ran too, blinking his eyes rapidly as though this might protect him. His mind had withdrawn completely in terror, and he did not think at all. Doll's sense of personal invulnerability was having a severe test, but had not as yet, like White's, failed. They were past the dead scouts now. More men on the left were beginning to go down, and behind them, over the top of the 3rd fold, suddenly came the 2nd platoon in full career, yelling hoarsely. This was the responsibility of 2nd Lieutenant Blaine. It was not a particularly complex responsibility. It had nothing to do with envy, jealousy, paranoia, or suppressed self-destruction. He, too, like White, knew what his orders were, and he had promised Bill White he would back him up and help him out. He, too, knew the Corps commander was watching, and he, too, wanted to do well today. Not as athletic as his fellow worker, but more imaginative, more sensitive, he, too, leaped up and motioned his men forward when he saw 1st platoon move. He could see the whole thing finished in his imagination, himself and White and their men standing atop the bombed-out bunkers in proper triumph, the position captured. He, too, died on the forward slope, but not at the crest like White. It took several seconds for the still-hidden Japanese gunners to raise their fire, and 2nd platoon was 10 yards down the gentle little slope before it was unleashed against them. 9 men fell at once, 2 died, and one of them was Blaine. Not touched by a machine gun, he unluckily was chosen as a target by 3 separate riflemen, none of whom knew about the others, or that he was an officer, and all of them connected. He bounced another 5 yards forward, and with 3 bullets in his chest cavity, did not die right away. He lay on his back and, dreamily and quite numb, stared at the high, beautiful, pure white cumuli, which sailed like stately ships across the sunny, cool, blue tropical sky. It hurt him a little when he breathed. He was dimly aware that he might possibly die as he became unconscious. 2nd platoon had just reached the 2 dead 1st platoon scouts when mortar shells began to drop in onto the 1st platoon 25 yards ahead. First 2, then a single, then 3 together popped up in unbelievable mushrooms of dirt and stones. Shards and pieces wickered and whirred in the air. It was the impetus needed, either to change the direction of the blind charge or to stop it completely. It did both. In the 2nd platoon, Staff Sergeant Keck watched everyone now with Lieutenant Blaine down, threw out his arms holding his rifle at the balance, dug in his heels and bellowed in a voice like the combined voices of 10 men for them to "Hit dirt! Hit dirt!" 2nd platoon needed no urging. Running men melted into the earth as if a strong wind had come up and blown them over like dried stalks. In the 1st platoon, less lucky, reaction varied. On the extreme right, the line had reached the first beginning slope of the right-hand ridge. Long hillock, really, and a few men, perhaps a squad, turned and dived into the waist-high grass there, defilading themselves from the hidden MGs above them as well as protecting them from the mortars. On the far left, that end had much further to go, 70 yards more to reach dead space under the left-hand ridge, but a group of men tried to make it. None of them reached it, however. They were hosed to earth and hiding by the machine guns above them, or bowled over stunned by the mortars, before they could defilade themselves from the MGs or get close to them to escape the mortars. Just to the left of the centre was the attached machine gun squad from Culp's platoon, allowed to join the charge by White through forgetfulness, or from some obscure tactical reason of his own, all 5 of whom, running together, were knocked down by the same mortar shell. Gun and tripod and ammo boxes all going every which way and bouncing end over end, although not one of the 5 was wounded by it. These marked the farthest point of advance. On the extreme left, 5 or 6 riflemen were able to take refuge in a bushy draw at the foot of Hill 209, which, a little farther down, became the deep ravine where Fox and George had been trapped and hit yesterday. These men began to fire at the 2 grassy ridges, although they could see no targets. In the centre of 1st Platoon's line, there were no defilades or draws to run to. The middle, before the mortars stopped them, had run itself right on down and out onto the dangerous low area, where they could not only be enfiladed by the ridges, but could also be hit by MG plunging fire from Hill 210 itself. Here there was nothing to do but get down and hunt holes. Fortunately, the TOT barrage had searched here as well as on the hillocks, and there were 105 and 155 holes available. Men jostled each other for them, shared them. The late Lieutenant White's 19th century charge was over. The mortar rounds continued to drop here and there across the area. Searching flesh, searching bone. Private John Bell of the 2nd Platoon lay sprawled exactly as his body had skidded to a halt, without moving a muscle. He could not see because his eyes were shut, but he listened. On the little ridges, the prolonged yammering of the MGs had stopped, and now confined itself to short bursts at specific targets. Here and there wounded men bellowed, whined or whimpered. Bell's face was turned left, his cheek pressed to the ground, and he tried not even to breathe too conspicuously, for fear of calling attention to himself. Cautiously, he opened his eyes, half afraid the movement of eyelids would be seen by a machine gunner 100 yards away, and found himself staring into the open eyes of the 1st Platoon's first scout lying dead 5 yards to Bell's left. This was, or had been, a young Greco-Turkish draftee named Kroll. Kroll was noted for 2 things: the ugliest bent-nosed face in the regiment and the thickest glasses in C for Charlie. That with such a myopia he could be a scout was a joke of the company. But Kroll had volunteered for it. He wanted to be where the action was, he said, in peace or in war. A hep kid from Jersey, he had nevertheless believed the 4-coloured propaganda leaflets. He had not known that the profession of first scout of a rifle platoon was a thing of the past and belonged to the Indian Wars, not to the mass divisions, superior firepower and tighter social control of today. First target the term should be, not first scout, and now the big glasses still reposed on his face. They had not fallen off. But something about their angle, at least from where Bell lay, magnified the open eyes until they filled the entire lenses. Bell could not help staring fixedly at them, and they stared back, with a vastly wise and tolerant amusement. The more Bell stared at them, the more he felt them to be holes into the centre of the universe, and that he might fall in through them to go drifting down through starry space amongst galaxies and spiral nebulae and island universes. He remembered he used to think of his wife's parts like that, in a more pleasant way. Forcibly, Bell shut his eyes, but he was afraid to move his head, and whenever he opened them again, there Kroll's eyes were, staring at him, their droll and flaccid message of amiable goodwill sucking at him dizzyingly, and wherever he looked, they followed him, pleasantly but stubbornly. From above, invisible but there, the fiery sun heat of the tropic day heated his head inside his helmet, making his soul limp. Bell had never known such eviscerating, bull-shrinking terror. Somewhere out of his sight, another mortar shell exploded, but in general the day seemed to have become very quiet. His arm with his watch on it lay within the range of vision, he noticed. My God, was it only 7:45? Defeatedly, he let his eyes go back where they wanted, to Kroll's. Here lies Four Eyes Kroll, died for something. When one of Kroll's huge eyes winked at him waggishly, he knew in desperation he had to do something, although he had been lying there only 30 seconds. Without moving, his cheek still pressed to the earth, he yelled loudly. Hey, Keck! He waited. Hey, Keck! We gotta get out of here! I know, came the muffled answer. Keck was obviously lying with his head turned the other way and had no intention of moving it. "What'll we do?" "Well?" There was silence while Keck thought. It was interrupted by a high, quavery voice from a long way off. "We know you there, Yank! Yank, we know you there!" "Told Joe, eat shit!" Keck yelled. He was answered by an angry burst of machine gun fire. "Roosevelt, eat shit!" the faraway voice screamed. "You goddamn right he does!" some frightened Republican called from Bell's blind right side. Then the firing stopped. Bell called again. "What do we do, Keck?" "Listen," came the muffled answer. "All you guys listen. Pass it along so everybody knows." He waited, and there was a muffled chorus. "Now get this. When I holler go, everybody up. Load and lock and have another clip on your hand. First and third squads staying put, kneeling position, and fire covering fire. Second and fourth squads hightail it back to that little fold. First and third squads fire 2 clips, then scoot. Second and fourth fire covering fire from that fold. If you can't see nothing, fire searching fire. Space your shots. Them positions is somewhere about halfway up them ridges. Everybody fire at the right-hand ridge, which is closer. You got that?" He waited while everyone muffledly tried to assure themselves that everybody else knew. "Everybody got it?" Keck called muffledly. There were no answers. "Then go!" he bellowed. The slope came to life. Bell, in second squad, did not even bother with the brave man's formality of looking about to see if the plan was working, but instead squirmed round and leaped up running, his legs already pistoning before the leap came down to earth. Safe beyond the little fold of ground, which by now had taken on characteristics of huge size, he whirled and began to fire cover, terribly afraid of being stitched across the chest like Lieutenant White, who lay only a few yards away. Methodically, he drilled his shots into the dun hillside, which still hid the invisible yammering MGs, one round to the right, one to the left, one to centre, one to the left. He could not believe that any of them might actually hit somebody. If one did, what a nowhere way to go. Killed by accident, slain not as an individual, but by sheer statistical probability, by the calculated chance of searching fire, even as he himself might be at any moment. Mathematics! Mathematics! Algebra! Geometry! When first and third squads came diving and tumbling back over the tiny crest, Bell was content to throw himself prone, press his cheek to the earth, shut his eyes and lie there. God, oh God, why am I here? Why am I here? After a moment's thought, he decided he'd better change it to, why are we here? That way, no agency of retribution could exact payment from him for being selfish.